Hello，大家好，我是 Evelyn。然后，如果听到我的声音的话，可以在那个聊天区打个一吗？打个一。好，非常好。那我就正式开始了。So, hello everyone. 大家下午好。Thanks for joining HKU Fudan IMBA Online Enrichment Talk. 欢迎大家来参加今天的港大复旦 IMBA 项目线上的知用课堂。I'm your host of today's sessions, Evelyn. I'm the Senior Program Manager from Hong Kong University Faculty of Business and Economics. I oversees the IMBA program. 我是 Evelyn，今天的主持人来自香港大学经济及工商管理学院港大复旦 IMBA 项目的高级课程统筹经理。今天的 IMBA 线上自用课堂是以英语为主，所以呢，接下来我就不一句一句翻译了，就从今天介绍今天的主讲嘉宾Mr. David Lee 和跟 David 沟通的时候大部分都会讲英语，需要的时候呢，我就会充当翻译，然后讲普通话。So today's session will be conducted in English. So from now on, I will mostly speak in English and switch to 普通话 when necessary. Okay. So here's today's agenda. I will first introduce David, and then David will do a 30 to 40 minutes sharing on the topic of leading in a volatile world. Lastly, we will do a Q&A session. So there are some general guidelines for today's session. Again, the sharing will be in English. If you have any questions, please raise it in the chat room anytime. I will keep track of the questions being asked and do a Q&A do it in the Q&A session. So please behave good in the chat room. No over-spamming, no offensive language. You can ask the question in Chinese. In the Q&A session, I will read and translate the questions in 普通话 during the Q&A. Okay. So I can see a lot of familiar names in the chat room. So a lot of IMBA alumni, current students are here today, but there's also a number of public audience and potential candidates. So let me quickly introduce David. David is a Korean, grew up and studied in US. That's why our students like to call David Oppa. He is the senior lecturer from the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Business and Economics. He teaches business ethics for IMBA, which is one of the core courses. If I remember correctly, David has been teaching IMBA since 2016. Right. So David is a 学霸, okay, who graduate from well-known universities such as UCLA, LSE, Harvard University, and Brigham Young University. He has degrees from law to psychology, East Asian studies, and politics. Before he joined Hong Kong University, David starts his career in Goldman Sachs and has the experience in investment management, such as a lawyer, in management consulting, startup, and venture capital. So David is not only a 学霸, okay, but he is also an excellent teacher. He received a number of teaching or teaching-related awards from program level, IMBA Teaching Award, to Faculty Teachers Award, to the University Teaching Award. And recently, he received a Hong Kong U Teaching Innovation Award as he and another Hong Kong U teacher, David Bishop, jointly created a MOOC course on FinTech ethics and risk. So you may think that I am like 老黄卖瓜自卖自夸. Now translated in English means every porter praise his own port. So instead of me just saying David is a very, very, very good teacher, so here I'm going to share with you some of the comments from our IMBA students who took David's course. So you can see on the slides, they find David's course is very inspiration and a lot of good feedback. So on Thursday evening, I saw a post on WeChat 朋友圈, a comment from students, and he said that 欧巴叫我找到人生的 calling. So Opa has guided me find my calling. So I think it summarizes how Davis teach and how our students, receive from his course and find a lot of values and inspirations. So I promised David I would do a 5 minutes introduction, and I've already overrun. So I shall pass my time to David. And let me just open everything and give the presentation mode to David. So David, your turn.
Hello.
Your turn.
Hi. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you for being here on a Saturday afternoon. As you can see, maybe outside my window, it's raining here in Hong Kong. But I'm thinking a lot this past week about what to share. And so as Evelyn was going through her introduction, I had a lot of memories about many of the IMBA classes I've taught the last few years. I hope all of you are doing well. That was a very kind introduction and many kind thoughts that many of you have shared. Obviously, it's a very difficult time now. And I think that's why I wanted to speak about this topic, leading in a volatile world. Recently, I had an interview. I was giving an interview for a newspaper earlier this week. And it was about the impact of the current COVID-19 kind of public health crisis that is obviously affecting the world. And as I was thinking about this interview and answering these questions, a few things came to mind. And maybe I'll start with this. And many of these are things that many of you will already know. But just to put context about when we talk about a volatile world, what does that mean? So I think as an adult, I've experienced 4 crises. So economic crises. So one was the Asian financial crisis. That was when I was still very young. And then after that, 9/11, the 9/11 terror attacks. I was in university at the time. And then following that, the global financial crisis. And then at the time, I was working in Hong Kong in finance. And then now this current crisis, COVID-19. Now, when I think about all these crises, obviously I was at different ages when all of these were happening. But when I think about this current crisis, really the word volatile, I think is quite appropriate. And I think the word unprecedented is quite appropriate. And why do I say that? Well, just in the last week, we have seen some very startling, very surprising numbers that have emerged. So, for example, the United States has just passed a stimulus package to help the economy. The size of the stimulus package is almost 10% of the whole total US GDP. And to even put that in more context, that stimulus package is almost double the size of the package that was used in the financial crisis in 2008. So it's almost 10% of the GDP and almost double the size of the global financial crisis stimulus package. Also this week, the United States just reported last week's unemployment numbers, and it had the largest new unemployment claims in any week in the history of the United States, over 3 million people. And that number obviously will continue to grow over the next few weeks, certainly. We've seen a lot of reports globally that businesses are severely affected by what's going on. And let's just put that in context. What does that mean? There are businesses during the global financial crisis about 10, 12 years ago who were impacted maybe 20 or 30%. Their business was impacted negatively 20 or 30%. Now we have businesses saying they're being impacted 80, 90%. So obviously the magnitude of this is quite high. I think for a lot of people, myself and probably for a lot of you, what you maybe feel like is when I think about the global financial crisis, I felt like that was mainly a Wall Street crisis that affected Main Street a little bit. But I think the COVID-19 public health crisis is going to be a Main Street crisis more. And that means it'll impact many of us, our family, friends, wherever they may be. And so it's important to think about that. And so why am I laying around talking about all this kind of bad news? Well, I think it's because things are so uncertain and so volatile and so unprecedented. It's important that in the midst of all of these things that are happening, that we have good leaders and we understand how to be better leaders. And I think all of you, all my former students, maybe some future students, and many of you on this forum right now, all have the potential to be good leaders, positive leaders in your community, in your family, in your businesses, in other organizations that you're a part of. And I think all of us have a responsibility to lead and lead better, especially in these tough times. And so this is why I wanted to talk today about leading in a volatile world. And really today, I want to talk about two concepts. One is a concept called VUCA, VUCA. You probably never heard of that before, but I'll talk to you about it. And the second one I was going to talk about is leadership agility. So let's start with VUCA. What is VUCA? So VUCA. So VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty is the U, C is complexity, and A ambiguity. Now, where did this come from? So this idea of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, quote unquote VUCA, it was a concept that was actually pioneered or thought about at the U.S. Army War College after the Cold War. And so why there? Well, as many of you know, from after World War II to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a Cold War, and it was kind of communism versus kind of the West and things like that. And when the Berlin Wall came down and much of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union transitioned to market economy and things like that, it was a very new world for the United States military. And as they were trying to strategize around what to do, who's the new, what are the new challenges that they're going to have? Is the Soviet Union still going to be a competitor? All these kind of things. They realized that the world was quite different than it was before. And the concept that came out of all of this thinking and research was VUCA. So this is why it's VUCA. I think this idea of VUCA is actually very relevant to what's going on today in today's world. Even before the COVID-19 public health crisis, I was giving a lot of talks just in the last few months, or talking to a lot of companies who are trying to deal with all of this change. They didn't know what to do. It was so much going on. And the concept that many people really, when they heard it, it really made sense to them or resonated with them was this idea of VUCA. And certainly, I think our world is definitely more volatile right now, right? That it's definitely more uncertain, certainly very complex, no easy solutions, but there's a lot of ambiguity, meaning we don't have all of the information. We're not sure what's going to happen. We can't predict the future. And I think if we think about our own lives at the organizational level as part of the companies we work at, but also at our individual personal lives, I think there's a lot of VUCA in the world, individually and in the business organization. And really, what contributes to VUCA? Well, I think it's two things. One is change is much faster, right? So the way we change, the way companies change, the way the competitive landscape changes is much faster. So there's accelerating change. And the second is we have growing interdependence amongst one another, but also amongst different countries, different markets, different economies. And I think that the way that the COVID-19 virus has spread is a testament to this idea of how interdependent all of the world is. And even though we may not want to be interdependent on other people in the world, the reality is we are tighter and closer and more intertwined at this point probably than ever before in the history of the world. And so it's important to understand that the pace of change as well as the interdependence together is pushing this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And as a result, it's very difficult to try to figure out, hey, what do we do? What's the plan? Now, it's within this context that we need to have agility. right? We need to have leadership leaders. That's the second thing I want to talk about. So we talked about the VUCA, Volatile. So I think everybody kind of understands that the world is an uncertain, volatile place. Now, if we go to the next slide, we'll start talking about agility. So this is a really interesting slide, I think, for two reasons. One is this guy who's surfing, he's actually really surfing. This is not a some sort of animation or something like that. This guy actually is really surfing, and he's in a suit. And so two things are interesting here. One is I think the water probably is one of the best symbols, or the ocean rather, is one of the best symbols of this idea of trying to manage a volatile and dynamic operating environment. Like in the ocean, things are always changing. Nothing is constant. And that is the reality of the world we live in today. So that's the first thing that's important. But also, the suit he's wearing, it looks like a very nice business suit. It looks much nicer than the suit I have on now. But that suit is actually a wetsuit. So it's actually not made of wool or cotton. It's actually made of a wetsuit material. So, it's kind of a little bit of a gimmick, but the idea was you could go surf in that in the morning and dry off and wear that same clothes to work in the afternoon, right? But I think it's a really interesting way to talk about, hey, we have to be ready to navigate all kinds of environments, right? And so to help think about that, I want to introduce how we can be more agile as leaders. So if we look on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about leadership agility. So let's start with just a quote. So there's this guy, some of you maybe have heard of him. He lived a long, long, long time ago in Italy. His name was Machiavelli. He was a political philosopher, a thinker. But he had a somewhat famous book that maybe some of you have read called The Prince. And in this book, he has this quote: "It should or ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous, or so perilous is dangerous, more dangerous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." So that's a very fancy way of saying one of the most dangerous things you can do as a leader is to introduce change, to lead change. And you're basically saying it's hard, right? And you become vulnerable. But this is the challenge that we all have, right? Okay, so if we go to the next quote, this is a quote from Peter Senge, who was a professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And this is, and he's not as old as Machiavelli. He was a researcher at MIT very recently, and he says people don't resist change; they resist being changed. Right? Oftentimes, both individually within our organizations, people don't like to have to deal with change, right? Which is why it becomes potentially dangerous or difficult or uncertain. But I think it's quite clear in a VUCA world, if we're not prepared to change and be agile to navigate and balance the ocean, then it's going to be quite challenging for all of us. So most of what I'm going to talk about today comes from a book that will appear here on the slide called Leadership Agility. This was a book that was published in roughly 2006 by Bill Joyner and Stephen Josephs. But it's probably the best book on describing leadership agility. They did a bunch of research, and I just want to talk about a few of the concepts that they introduced. So if we go to the next slide, we can start exploring what does leadership agility mean. So first thing, let's talk about agile leadership types. Now, there are different types of leaders out there in the world. And if we talk about leaders who are the greatest percentage of leaders are either experts, achievers, or catalysts, right? Now, there are a number of leaders who are pre-expert, who are maybe that they don't have a lot of knowledge, but they're, usually that's not the majority of leaders. The majority of leaders, they enter into this cone, and as you can see, the cone, as it gets towards catalyst, it expands, it gets bigger, and so we'll talk a second about why that is. But here you go. It's basically a progression. Most of us, when we become leaders because we're expert on something. Right? We can really show our knowledge or value because we know something. And then that kind of expands because we have that expertise. It helps us achieve things, right? But once you become a catalyst, it's no longer about you. The catalyst is you helping other people or your organization achieve more, right? So the expert and achiever stage of this is more individual focused, or the catalyst is more organizational focused. And the idea is as you develop as a leader, you get towards the catalyst stage. And as you do that, as you can see on the right of the screen, catalysts have more self-awareness. They have greater perspective. They also have greater curiosity and empathy. And so these things expand as we, or come together more as we become better leaders. Now, the only other thing I maybe want to say on this before we move on is sometimes people describe this as like an expert style leader is he has a hero mentality. So like, I have to be the hero. I'm the expert. I know what to do. I'm the hero. The important thing here for leaders who develop into agile leaders is the idea that they start thinking beyond themselves. They become not just about me being the hero, it's more about me helping everybody else achieve. And this mentality and this different framework is really important. Okay, let's briefly go to the next slide if we can. And this is just a breakdown and we're not going to go through this, but the only thing I want to show is what at least certain surveys have shown is that pre-experts are about 10% of the leadership pool, experts about 45% of the leadership pool, achievers are 35% of the leadership pool, and then when we get to catalysts, the tip of the big part of the cone who have the biggest impact, that's actually less than 10%. And within catalysts, there are different types of even leadership types, which it gets the number becomes even smaller. So all this slide is showing or means is that the leaders who have the greatest impact or who are the most agile leaders, there aren't many of them running around, right? And so what I want to talk about, what are some of the traits that we can develop to hopefully become more agile leaders? I'm sure most of you are at least experts or achievers. Right? Most of you are very focused on getting things done. You're very knowledgeable about the things you're doing. But how can we move into a catalyst type of leadership where we have greater vision, we're much more strategic, and we're focused on those around us as opposed to just our own success? Okay, so if we can go to the next slide. So within leadership agility competencies, there's this compass that the authors put together. And within leadership agility, there's basically four main competencies or capabilities. And so I'm going to talk about what those four are. So the first is context setting agility. The second is stakeholder agility. The third is creative agility. And the fourth is self-leadership agility. So what do all those mean? So context setting agility is basically, are you willing and able to have a strategic view, basically? Do you understand the context? Right? And within context setting agility, if you look in the compass in the image, it says context setting agility, and there are two characters underneath it. One, the first is situational awareness, and the second is a sense of purpose. Now, for those of you that have been in my class before, we talk about purpose a lot, right? And this is why it's important. If you don't have a good sense of purpose, both individually or from an organizational perspective, then it's very difficult for you to have a strategic view, right? Additionally, situational awareness, what is that? That means understanding what's going on in the world, right? A lot of people, unfortunately, lack situational awareness. Now, here's a very easy example of that. Let's say, in the future, you go to a family gathering. So there are family members there. And unfortunately, one of your family members, their business had a big problem. Well, if you have low or poor situational awareness, you maybe ask this family member in front of everybody, how's the business going? How are you doing? That's probably low situational awareness, right? You're not understanding the context or the situation. It's probably not a good time to ask that question. But there are people who do that all the time, right? Now, for a leader, it's very important to understand what the situation is, be able to connect some dots, which we're going to talk about that a bit more in one of the other ones. So that's context setting. The next is stakeholder agility, and that's exactly what most of you are probably imagining. Understanding who your stakeholders are, right? And So who are your key stakeholders, and then how can you create some sort of alignment or synergy with those stakeholders, right? And that's something I think all of us have heard about, but within this leadership agility framework, there's two factors. One is stakeholder understanding, and the other is understanding power. And I think those are both incredibly important. What is your power style? What is their power style? What do your stakeholders need? Right? What are their incentives? How can we all win together? This takes a lot of negotiating, right? But first, before you do that, you have to know who your stakeholders are and what motivates them, and then be able to start trying to balance their interests versus yours and create a win-win situation through negotiation, through building trust, through communication, right? Okay, so stakeholder agility. The next is creative agility. Now, what is that? Basically, it comes down to how kind of insightful or creative can a leader be when faced with a new problem, right? Now, this is difficult sometimes because oftentimes in business we don't think of creativity as one of the things that we are assessed on, right? So if you think about most people when they go to someone to do some work for them, for a contractor or a lawyer or any kind of work, most of the time we want that person just to get the job done. And if that person has a lot of experience doing the job in a certain way and we know it works, then frequently we just say, hey, don't need to be creative. Just do it the way it works, right? Now, the problem in VUCA environments is that the problem has become different, right? It's not just a standard problem anymore. So now it actually requires a creative solution. As a result, then leaders have to become more creative. How does that happen? Well, there's at least two factors that they found in their research. One is reflective judgment. The second is connective awareness. So what's reflective judgment? That sounds really fancy, but all it is being able to take a step back and understand the situation, right? You want to be able to reflect, understand the situation, understand the context of what's going on. How is this problem, the new problem, different than the old problem, right? You want to be able to understand that. You want to understand, okay, what resources do I have? These are all things that you want to take a step back and try to assess. And then as you think about what's different, you'll get different types of data. So I think of this as different dots, a variety of different dots. And this is where the connective awareness comes in. The best strategic thinkers are able to connect the dots. All right, so I'll say that again. The best strategic thinkers are able to connect the dots. Now, what does that mean? Well, oftentimes, most people, if there's a business situation and a problem occurs, most people can think through the first impact. What is the first level of analysis or the first order, initial order issue? But most people cannot think beyond that. They can't think to the second order or third order implications of something that's occurred. And this is where I would like all of you to start thinking about. So everybody knows if A happens, then B will happen. Most people can figure that out. But most people can't think about, oh, then C may happen and D may happen. Okay? And so this is where connecting the dots or connective awareness is important. To be able to take these different forms of data and try to create a narrative which will allow you to think about what will happen beyond just the immediate first step. Okay? And that's really important for a leader too. Okay? And the last characteristic here, competency, is self-leadership agility. And that's basically being able to lead yourself, right? Are you good at seeking feedback? Are you good at trying to be better every day, right? Because sometimes certain leaders get to the point where they become the leader and they realize, hey, maybe I don't need to change anymore. If I don't change anymore, no one's going to say anything to me because I'm the leader. It doesn't matter. But self-leadership, what that requires is being able to take feedback, having a desire to continue to improve, which is why under the self-leadership agility part of the compass, you can see there's a developmental motivation. So that's the idea of you have a desire, motivated to continue developing, to continue to be better. And then a self-awareness, which means you understand what parts you're weak on. Now, I think a lot of us, we generally don't like receiving feedback. It's oftentimes very uncomfortable, I think, right? I think that's the case for many of us. But I think that's a way for leaders to grow. And so next time someone gives you feedback, that could be your spouse, that could be your boss, that could be your children, whoever gives you feedback, even if it's makes you upset, angry, whatever, just take a step, pause, and just remember this moment and remember what I'm about to say. Think of feedback as a gift. Okay, I'll say it again. Think of feedback as a gift. Even if it's something you don't want to hear, even if it's something you think is absolutely wrong, just think of it as a gift. Why? Because for some reason, that person is thinking that. You may not know why, but that's what they believe. So that gives you an opportunity to reflect on why would that person think that? I don't think of myself that way, but this person does. So why is that? That's an opportunity for you to reflect, to be more aware. And if they happen to be right, then you can figure out ways to change. If they don't happen to be right, or if you feel like it doesn't matter, then of course you can ignore it. But ultimately, this is what we're trying to get to when we're self-aware. Receiving feedback, being open to feedback, and then trying to change. Okay, so these are the competencies that they developed. Context setting, stakeholder agility, creative agility, and self-leadership agility. These are all different types of agile leadership skills that we can work on, even in times of crisis like this. All right, so let's go to the next slide now. Let me see. There we go. So I want to try to give you three tips related to the things we're talking about. So far I've talked about some theoretical kind of conceptual things. So now let me give you three different types of feedback that can help you right now. Now, some of my former students who have heard this, hopefully they remember it, but we'll see we'll see if you remember it. Okay. So the first thing is, back to the previous slide, please. The first thing is applying strategic thinking to your life. Now, a lot of large companies, so some of you work at large companies, a lot of large companies spend millions of dollars or millions or tens of millions of renminbi on doing strategic planning, right? 5-year plan, 3-year plan. Sometimes they hire consultants, all these things. So a lot of resources are put into strategic planning and thinking. Now, some of you may have been part of those kind of projects at work, doing 1-year, 3-year, 5-year plans. What I always find ironic is that the same people who are doing strategic thinking, who are doing this kind of strategic planning for their companies, they oftentimes don't apply that same strategic thinking to their own lives. Like, this is the great irony of this. At work, they're all about being strategic, but in their personal life, they're not strategic. Okay, so one way to do that, or one way to address that is, or one way to apply strategic thinking to your life is thinking 3 steps ahead. Now, what do I mean by that? So hopefully former students will remember this. Most people, let's imagine all of you, tomorrow, you get contacted by somebody to take a new job. And oftentimes, the prime criteria that many of you will use to consider if you should seriously think about taking a new job or not is what? Salary, right? Is money. Now, the problem here is if you take every next job solely based on non-strategic criteria, such as just money, then there's a high probability that you end up 3-10 years later in a job that you don't like because you don't have a sense of purpose and you didn't think strategically. What this is a life that is an outcome of non-strategic thinking decisions. So let me draw. I have a little graphic here, a small whiteboard thing here. So imagine this is you. Let's see if I can get a closer camera. So imagine this is you, and you take your first job here, and you don't like it, but it was a good job. Now, let's say a few years pass by, and somebody says you can take. We want to give you a new job. You're going to do the same thing, but you're going to get paid 20% more. Okay. Most people, I would imagine, most of you, 99% of us would say, "Oh, yes, same job, get paid more." The problem is we don't like the job, but they're going to pay us more. So we take that next step. We have plus 20% increase in income. Okay. Now, let's say another few years pass by. Same thing happens. somebody comes up, they says, hey, we're going to give you a new job. You're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to have a similar role, but now you get to manage some people, and we're going to increase your salary again 20%. Okay. Plus 20%. Okay, so here, basically, if this is 3 different jobs, roughly, we can say that's about 10 years. Most people are in jobs between 2 to 4 years. So let's just use the average and say this is a 10-year period. This whole time, though, you realize you didn't like your job, but the only reason you kept moving was because you were getting paid more. Okay, now let's say you restart and you think, hey, I'm going to be strategic. I'm going to think about what I want to do. So let's assume whatever this job is, it's not what you want, and you say, hey, I want to go into marketing. Okay, so let's hypothetically say you're an accountant. Let's just say you're an accountant. This is the first job, but you don't really want to be an accountant. You want to go into marketing. Well, the first job is the same. But because you're thinking strategic, when the time comes for you to take another job, you don't take the job that takes you away from marketing. You maybe take a step back a little bit into, let's say, a different alternative here. Maybe you have to take a minus 10% pay cut, even, okay? But you're now, instead of going to another accounting job where you get paid more, but you're still not close to your dream job, you actually take a step back, take a little pay cut, but maybe you're doing some accounting at a marketing company, right? So now at least you're in the right industry, even though your function hasn't changed. And then a few years later, you take a job, and now they're going to pay you more, let's say plus 20%. Sorry, my marker's running out of ink. But now you're doing a marketing job. Okay, this is a job maybe that you actually wanted. Now, 10 years, so if you look at situation A up here, you're 10 years later in your career, you're making maybe a little bit more money, but you're unhappy doing what you want to do. And because you've been in this career for so long, now you probably have some sort of financial commitments, maybe some family commitments. You cannot afford to take a step back here and make this much less money. So people here, maybe they end up making a little bit more money in the short run, but they end up becoming a lot more dissatisfied with their career in the long run. Now here, because you had strategic thinking, this allows you to take a step back to get onto a better path for you, which over the long run allows you to be in a happier career and probably make as the same amount, if not more money than you would had you taken this path, right? This is the power of strategic thinking in one's life. Applying strategic thinking principles that you would normally apply in a work context to your own life and professional planning. Why is that important? Because most people are dissatisfied with their work for a variety of different reasons. But most people, the opportunity cost for changing and switching is so high that they are just happy, or they just endure not doing what they really want to do. I think all of us, I think if we think about how long we're all going to work in life, a lot of us are probably going to live at least to 100. Most of that time we're going to be working. I think life is too short to do things, that we don't want to do, right? So if we can find opportunities, even if it means investing 6 months to a year of doing other things to get to that goal, then I think that sacrifice is worth it. And so this is the power of strategic thinking. So whenever you have opportunities, particularly in your professional life, I always urge my students to think 3 steps ahead. So they'll say, oh, I got this opportunity. I'm saying, that's great. Okay, what does that lead to? And what would that lead to after that? What do you want to do? So what does that picture look like in 10 years as opposed to tomorrow? And if you can continue to push yourself to think that way, you develop a much more strategic mindset in the decisions that you make, which I hope you become a more agile leader. Okay, so that's the one. The second tip I think I want to give related to this is about finding a calling. And so if we can go to the next slide, and as we think about people's work and we reflect on purpose, so this is a research that was done by a professor at Yale University, Amy Wojcicki. She's at the Yale School of Management, and she's done a lot of research on how people feel about their jobs, how people feel about their work. Now, the majority of people in the world, when they think of work, it's only a job. And what does that mean? Well, it has 2 components, really, in my view. The first is they do it because they need the money, right? So if you think about the person who works at your local fast food restaurant, them working there, there's nothing wrong with that job. That their work is honest work. They're not harming anybody, etc. Right? But I don't think when that person was in, say, secondary school, they thought, hey, my goal is to make more French fries for people. That was not their dream, right? So the reason they're in that kind of work, the reason they're doing the work in the fast food restaurant is, let's be honest, they probably need the money. They have commitments to fulfill. They need somewhere to live. They need food to eat. So they just need the money. So people who think of their work as solely a job generally have the lowest rates of satisfaction about the work that they're doing. Okay. Now, the next group up above a job are people who think of their work as a career, right? And so if we can click, that will get us to career. Yeah. And what does that mean? Well, a career, the idea of the category of a career captures things related to a job, meaning the money is helpful, right? You need to pay bills, you need to pay your mortgage, you need to support your family, etc. But in addition to that, what does a career give you? A career generally gives you psychological fulfillment, right? Because oftentimes in a career you have progression, right? You work for 2 years, maybe you get promoted. You work for 4 years, maybe you get promoted, or you get an award or something like that. So embedded within a career, there is this psychological satisfaction that happens. Why is this important? It's important to realize this because our whole lives, ever since we're like little kids, we have had progression. You go from kindergarten to first grade to second grade to third grade, et cetera, et cetera. And that continues all the way through university. But once we leave university and go off into the working world, it's not always clear that there is this progression. So for the first 22, 23 years of our life, we always feel like we're somehow improving. We're moving up, right? Moving from grade to grade, getting report cards, things like this. These are things that are giving us feedback. But once you leave the working world, or once you leave your youth and move into adulthood, that kind of progression, natural progression, basically stops, right? And as you get further along in your career, there's oftentimes no natural time where people say, okay, now you get to move up. Now you get this award. Like these things don't happen regularly. They don't happen naturally. And people crave that psychological kind of affirmation. And this is why a lot of people who are doing work that they consider a career, even though it's not great, they stay in it because they miss being told you're doing a good job, right? Here's your promotion. This is what you're doing well, right? And so a career, just because you're in a career, doesn't mean you love your job, you love your work. In fact, there are lots of people who are in career roles who don't love their work, right? Most of the lawyers that I know, for example, they would like to do other things, but they're in a career. It sounds prestigious. They make good money. It's very difficult to make a switch. Okay. But that said, people in a career, they have slightly higher satisfaction than people in a job. So they tend to enjoy their work more than people who just have a job. Now, at the tip of all of this is something called a calling. Now, the vast majority of people don't find their calling. Now, what I want to encourage all of you to do is try to find your calling. It may take a while. You may have a few callings, but spend some time thinking about it. So remember, we talked about the Agile leadership types. A large part of being an Agile leader was reflecting. So take some time to reflect. How do we do that? Well, you can meditate. You can write in a journal. You can write notes. You can get feedback from other people. There's a lot of different ways to help you hone in on the things that give you the most satisfaction and motivation. Now, the people who have found their calling tend to have the highest rates of satisfaction in the work that they're doing. So I'll say that again. The people who feel like they have found their calling tend to have the highest rates of satisfaction in the work that they're doing. That doesn't mean they're the richest. And in fact, they're probably oftentimes not going to be maximizing their economic output, but they're maximizing other things that give them fulfillment. Now, frequently, people who have found the calling, oftentimes these are people whose work somehow involves helping somebody else, right? And I think there's tremendous benefit in that. I think even now, in the midst of all this virus stuff, I think we can find tremendous satisfaction in giving service, in giving help to others, and then also receiving service and help from others. And I think that's the core part of our humanity, right? So we should keep that in mind, not just in this virus situation, but also as leaders. Part of being an agile leader and being at a catalyst type of leader is being authentic and being a servant to those people that you lead. Now, again, I'm not just talking about this in a company setting, though it could apply. But I'm also talking about this in our families, in our non-work organizations. Maybe you volunteer, maybe you're a part of a social group. Any of these types of, those are all different types of organizations where we can have impact through helping and serving others. I think this is a part of being a leader. Now, a calling will be different for all of you. But if I share an example from my own life, and I've heard, I've told this, shared this experience rather in my own classes, and I think some of the students on the chat will have heard this. But I quickly I had an experience that made me realize teaching was my calling. So I'll give you an example. Let me tell this story. When I was my first year teaching at HKU, a friend contacted me. He said, "Let's have breakfast." And this was a friend that I had known for many years. Both of us had come out to Hong Kong together about 15 years ago, and initially were working in finance. In my own situation, I obviously did some other things outside of finance. So I left finance and did some other things. This particular friend, he stayed in finance and continued to do well in his career. And he had moved to a few other places, and now he was moving back to Hong Kong. And so he said, "Hey, we're moving back to Hong Kong. Let's get together for breakfast and catch up." I said, "Sure." And he says, "Let's have breakfast at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in downtown Hong Kong." Well, as some of you will know, that's a very fancy hotel. I normally don't eat breakfast at places like that, but I said, "Sure." And so I went to breakfast. I met him. We're good friends, so we caught up. It was great to talk to him and hear about his life. And at the end of breakfast, the bill came out. Okay. And so the bill for the breakfast came out. And as you can imagine, this is a very nice hotel in Hong Kong. The bill was not too cheap. It was a bit expensive. But, you know, we did a very Asian thing. The bill came out, and we argued about who's going to pay the bill. So he said, "I'll pay." And then I said, "I'll pay." And we kind of back and forth with the bill. And then finally, he says, "David, don't worry. I make about 1 million US dollars a year now." Okay. So when he told me that, what's the first thing that I thought? Of course, the first thing that I thought was, you pay the bill then. So he paid the bill. And we had a good time. We left. He paid the bill, and we separated. I actually was coming back to school. And on my way back to school, I was thinking about this. I was like, wow, he's making 1 million US dollars a year now. How do I feel about that? And two things came to mind. One was I was really happy for him. The reason is he's a close friend. I know how hard he had worked, how much he had sacrificed to be successful, and I was happy for him as a friend. I had no any kind of competition. I was just really happy for him. And the second thing that came to mind, though, that was most important about related to what we're talking about, purpose and calling, was I thought, do I have any regret about not staying in finance and going to teach? And I didn't. And my wife and people around me sometimes joke. They say, "You're the only person we know that started their career at Goldman Sachs and continues to make less money as their career progresses," right? Which is basically true. And so as I thought about that, I had no regrets about not pursuing a career in finance. I had no regrets about leaving all of that type of money on the table because I had found so much purpose in my teaching and working with students like all of you. And so for me, I realized, oh, that's my calling. One of my callings in life is to teach. And I've continued to teach ever since then. Now, there's a comment here that people have asked, "Hey, well, it's difficult to find your calling." It absolutely is difficult. And you know what? That's the great puzzle of life. That is one of our responsibilities as humans, to figure out what our puzzle is, right? The calling that I have will be different than the calling that you have, different than the calling that your parents had. the reality and the sad reality is that most people in life never figure out what their calling is, and you can have more than one calling, right? There could be a few different things. In my own life, it's to try to be a good teacher, it's try to be a good father and husband, all these things. But it's incumbent, it's our responsibility to try to figure it out. And how do we do that? I think we do it a lot of ways. We do it by learning. So joining talks like this, reading books, meeting people, talking to people, exploring, meditating, reflecting, all of these things, and figuring out what gives us meaning, what's giving us satisfaction. And it takes a lot of experimentation. Our lives are the greatest experiment that we're ever going to be a part of, right? And so I encourage people to push themselves, to take challenges, to get out of their comfort zone. The older we get, the more unwilling we are to get out of our comfort zone because we're embarrassed, because time, whatever it may be. That said, I would highly encourage all of you to do things that get you out of your comfort zone, which gets us to our next point. On the next slide, and this is kind of my last tip, I guess, before we move into questions, is the principle of 1% improvement. So former students hopefully will remember this. I usually share this on the first day of class. Whatever class I teach, it could be IMBA, it could be undergrad, anything. I always share this slide. It's the principle of 1% improvement. And what does that mean? The principle of 1% improvement means that it's very rare that companies or people or anybody who's done anything spectacular achieves success overnight. Things don't happen overnight, right? There's a lot of work that goes into people being successful, usually over long periods of time with very disciplined effort. That's the principle of 1% improvement. Can each of us try to improve ourselves 1% on a regular basis? This is the challenge. So I'm going to challenge all of you to try to improve yourself 1% a week as a better leader, as a better manager, as a better whatever you want. But try to improve yourself 1% a week beyond what's expected of you. So there are things that are already expected of us. Beyond that, are there ways that you can grow? It could be from a health perspective. It could be from a knowledge perspective. It could be from a communication perspective. Whatever approach you want to take, try to improve yourself 1% a week. Now, why do I say that? I'm going to show you two things. The first is, a lot of this comes from psychology. There's something called deliberate practice in psychology. And what deliberate practice means is the amount of time you practice something is important, but actually what's even more important than that is the amount of time you do very focused, intense type of practice. So just because you sit in front of the piano and hit a few keys for 10 hours a day doesn't make you a good piano player. But if you sit down for 30 minutes and do very focused type of practice, then you could become a very good piano player, right? So it's not just about the time. It's being very deliberate and strategic about how you improve. Okay, so that's the first thing. This research comes from psychology. Now, let me show you a little bit of basic math, I guess. So I asked my students, my undergrads at HKU, their standard semester is 13 weeks, give or take. And so on the first day of class, I always say, I challenge all of you to improve yourself 1% in some way over 13 weeks. And if you do that, I asked them, how much do you think you will improve? Now, this is where it becomes interesting. The people who have taken accounting or corporate finance will have a different answer than the people who have not taken accounting or corporate finance. Why? The people who have not taken accounting or corporate finance before, they will just say 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 13 times is 13%. But the people who have taken corporate finance or accounting will say, oh, something's there. It's beyond 13%. And this is the principle of compounding, right? So if you can see the next point here, So if you use the principle of compounding over a 13-week period, improving yourself 1% a week over a 13-week period, you'll be improved almost 14%, right? This is the power of compounding. Knowledge, like credit or capital, compounds, right? Why? Because as you improve your knowledge, you're able to connect more dots. As a result, you're able to be more strategic. You're able to be more creative. You're able to be a better problem solver, which ties into being a more agile leader. Now imagine if you could commit to improving yourself 1% a week over a whole year, over 52 weeks. What would that look like? So the next number will show us. Through compounding, 1% a week is almost 70%. So imagine if all of you, let's say you were starting your MBA program today, and a year from now, if you could be 70% better than you are today, wouldn't the sacrifice be worth it? Certainly. Now, let me tell you the end of the story. On the last day of class, at the end of 13 weeks for my undergrads, I asked my students, I put this same slide up and I asked them, how many of you finished this commitment? How many of you actually did it? And in a class of 80 or 100, I'll get one or two. The vast majority have completely forgotten about this, right? And you can tell when they see the slide, they're like, oh, I forgot about it. You can just tell from their facial expression. But then what I say here is important, and this applies equally to 20-year-old undergrads as well as people like yourselves who are in your careers. The discipline to do gradual improvement over long periods of time is the difference between people who live ordinary lives and people who live extraordinary lives. For me, it ultimately comes down to discipline, right? And so this is my challenge to all of you. I hope that some of the stuff that we've talked about today allows you to reflect. And my real challenge here is, it's difficult. Somebody commented, how do you quantify 1%? Don't think of this as a pure math problem. Think of this as a mindset, right? This is what's key. And I know many of us are in various forms of kind of self-lockdown, not really going out, maybe having to work from home, things like that. I understand that it's frustrating. I understand that you feel like your freedom has been constricted and there's challenges and things like that. Everybody's feeling that way, right? What I would challenge you to do is carve out some time every day or every week to focus. Hey, I know everybody else is feeling that way. I'm going to find some time that I can just be better, right? So that could be doing exercise, and that could be reading more books. That could be reaching out to people and just connecting with them, serving them, just touching base. Whatever you feel like that 1% of improvement is, I would challenge you to focus on that. Because as you do that, that will lead to other things. And as you get better and more disciplined at this, you'll continue to be able to grow and compound your knowledge, your ability, and really be able to have an impact as a leader and really develop the skills of agile leadership. So on that note, I think I've maybe talked a little bit too long, but I'll start taking some questions. But I just really want to wish all of you all the best during this very difficult and trying time for so many. I think in the midst of these kind of times, it's important for us to remember the humanity that connects us and not the things that divide us. And we think about the opportunities we have to try to be examples and serve those around us. And through those experiences, I think we better leaders, we can find our callings and ultimately kind of live up to the potential and aspirations that we have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes?
so there are two slides. Do I need to show them all as well?
No need. The next slide is just questions. So you can just leave
Okay.
that up if you want. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So questions time. So if there's any questions, please type it in the 聊天 chat room. And we, in fact, received some questions behind. It's a 提问 session. So
Okay.
maybe I will go for the first one. It's from Nancy. Can David elaborate more on catalyst leadership? What actions can be considered as catalyst?
Yeah. So is it Nancy, right, Evelyn?
That's Nancy. Nancy.
Okay. Nancy, thanks for the question. Thanks for participating today. So what qualifies or how do we know what catalyst leadership is? So I think catalyst leadership at its core is non-selfish. So other forms of leadership. So when we're younger, the type of quote unquote leadership we take on is, oh, I want to have a title, or I want to be the one who's rewarded, or I want to show. I think when you're a catalyst, you're really empowering the people you're leading in order to achieve things. You're helping them develop. And if you imagine, as capable as you may be as a leader, imagine you started putting that talent and helping develop the talent of the people beneath you to develop those kind of same skills. Then imagine collectively how that organization, powerful that organization could be, right? This is, in my mind, what being a catalyst is all about. It's not just about you becoming your best self, really. It's about helping others become their best selves as well. But as you do that process, you'll find that you're also developing as well. So hopefully that answers that.
Okay, so thank you. Next question is from Michael. He said that supermarket shelves are being empty and cash is the only precious commodity in the financial market. There's this financial crisis now. Do you think that it's the financial crisis that rise? What are the signs that financial crisis has come or not? What's your view?
So let me just make sure I understand. So Michael's understand is this are we in a financial crisis?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that remains to be seen. Certainly, we are in a crisis, and certainly in some countries, we are in the beginnings of an economic crisis. And so, let me give you an example here. So, I work with some. So in some of the work I do as an advisor, I sometimes end up talking to business leaders and CEOs. And recently, this past week, I've been talking to some business people in the context of some of the portfolio companies that they have. And across the world, the portfolio companies that we've been talking about, it doesn't matter. They're all being hit. Even in industries that you feel like are not going to be directly related to what's happening, like, say, travel, are being hit. And so is that a crisis? It's certainly worrying. It's approaching, in some places, certainly in the world, it's already a crisis. In other places, it's becoming a crisis. Now, how can we prevent that? That's the question that I think a lot of people are trying to figure out, which is why you're seeing so many governments now, like in the United States and in South Korea and in Europe, doing a lot of stimulus packages, different forms of fiscal and monetary policy to try to put as much liquidity or cash into the economy so it dries up. The unfortunate reality is, even amongst companies that I've seen or working with, is that some of them, for example, had financing that was lined up, being planned for the next few weeks. But because of the current crisis, that financing has been cut off, right? And on the extreme end, there are some U.S. investors who think the capital markets in the United States will effectively be closed to a lot of companies for at least in the next year, effectively. And so they're looking for alternative forms of financing. But I think the real issue is, and this is the part that we have to see what happens. If companies or businesses right now are shut down, and that shutdown occurs for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is, then for a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, a lot of sole proprietorships, so small businesses, most of those businesses cannot sustain that. Like, they do not sit on enough resources, cash or otherwise, to be able to not have revenue for 1, 2, 3 months. And so what will happen is you'll see a lot of those businesses go away. And even if businesses do come back, a lot of that hiring may be quite impaired. So certainly some businesses may not be able to come back even. And so this is a concern. I think we're not sure right now. I think this is the key point. I think nobody knows for sure. But what governments are trying to do is trying to get out ahead of it by trying to pump as much liquidity into the market as possible.
Right. Okay. So let's go to the next questions from Zhang Jun. He said, "Leader make decision in the time of peace or world. Leader may be able to glean as much info as possible, assess, and then make the best decision reflecting interests of the majority. But in face of extremely uncertainty or VUCA, where situations change rapidly, how can leader ensure that the decision that they make is the best one possible? They don't have enough time to assess everything."
Yeah. And so that's a really good question. And I think of it in two ways. So maybe the first thing I'll say is so whenever I do like executive training, or sometimes we do leadership training for people who are about to become senior leaders or CEOs or general managers. And one of the things we always talk about is the thing that makes leadership or decision making difficult is scarcity, right? So imagine the things that are difficult: capital, human resources, and just having the right data. If you have unlimited time, then these decisions are not that difficult, right? Or if you have unlimited capital, then it's not that difficult. Or if you have unlimited information, then these decisions aren't that difficult. It's because all of those things, data, human capital, like employees, talent, etc., and financial capital, it's because those things are scarce that makes leadership difficult. So the scarcity, you're right, is what creates a lot of the difficulty. So how do we know we're making, quote unquote, the right decision during periods of time like this? Oftentimes you don't. And so this is what I was recently teaching a class about this earlier this week. And the point I was trying to emphasize is, as humans, when we think of if a decision was right or wrong, we often just look at the outcome. This is a very consequential perspective. We just look at the outcome. If the outcome was good, then it must have been a good decision. But actually, that's not always the case, right? You could have made a bad decision, but you had good luck and the decision worked out, right? And so what I try to challenge people to think about, particularly from a leadership decision-making perspective, from an ethical decision-making perspective, is that irrespective of what the outcome is, even if you end up getting an outcome that you don't want, at the time that you made the decision, did you feel like it was right? Like morally, did you feel like from a business perspective, whatever perspective, did you feel like the right decision? Because ultimately at the end of the day, that's all you can control. Oftentimes we have no control on the outcome. And so to say that's what's going to determine a good or bad decision for you individually as a leader, that's very difficult. So I like to try to focus on the factors that I can control, right? And if that's the case, then I'm going to try to control the factors as much as possible so I can make the best decision at this moment. And at that moment when I make the decision, if I feel like it was the right decision, even though the outcome wasn't great, then at least I can feel comfortable with myself. And I think that's what's really the most important thing.
Okay, so next questions. Oh, before I do the next questions, some of the audience. So next question is from Simon. He said that could you give some tips on how a professional to become a leader? Let's say an in-house lawyer. Wait a second. Let me open your microphone first.
Okay, so I think maybe two things related to that. I think so it sounds like Simon may be an in-house lawyer. I used to be an in-house lawyer at one point in my life. And I think when you think about leadership, what does that mean? Well, at a certain level, you don't have to wait to be a leader. Even within your legal team, I'm sure there are certain roles that you can assume to take on more leadership opportunities. Now, most legal teams in-house, in my experience, and law firms in general, they are pretty lean, so the teams are not that big. But oftentimes you're working with other teams. So basically you're an in-house lawyer supporting other businesses or other functions. So, I would say try to make yourself valuable to other teams if your team is smaller and there's not a lot of leadership opportunities by, volunteering and putting your hand up to help out, really demonstrating your value. And I think as you do that, people will understand that you have more and more value to the organization beyond just as a lawyer. I think that's important. I think the second thing that's important is to demonstrate that you are a clear communicator and problem solver. So oftentimes, I think organizationally, people think of lawyers and compliance people and risk people as people who always say no. I think sometimes you have to do that, but also think of ways that you can solve problems for them. Not just be the person who's saying no, but can you figure out solutions for them, and can you communicate in an effective way to add value beyond just the legal function that you're doing? I think in my own life, that's what I've tried to do, and that allowed me to experience a few different things. And then I would say, lastly, it's not just you have opportunities to expand your leadership skill set, not just in your organization, but outside the organization as well. So if you're part of different social groups, if you're, within your family, etc. So I would look for opportunities like that as well to start making steps. And then, lastly, there are a lot of former lawyers who have been CEOs of companies. And so look at their life stories. So when I was working at Goldman Sachs, the CEO of Goldman Sachs was Lloyd Blankfein. Lloyd Blankfein started off his career as a lawyer for 3 or 4 years at a law firm. He was doing tax law, of all things. And he eventually made his way into Goldman Sachs and eventually became CEO. So there's a lot of stories around that. So don't think of what you're doing as somehow that narrows what you can be as a leader. I think there are lots of ways to just expand your opportunities, but I think you just take it one step at a time.
Right. So this is I want to show for those who are interested to our program. Please join us. If you have any problem, you can add. There's a QR code I'm going to show soon. Yes. So just if you're a potential candidate looking for the our IMBA program, please scan the QR code and you will know our information. So we'll still have some more questions. The next one is from Rebecca. So she asked, "What is your opinion on the Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours theory? Have you heard about that?" Yeah. Well, just wait a second. Let me allow.
Yeah, so Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, talked about geniuses spend 10,000 hours on something, and most of the time when people read that, they think, oh, if I just do something for 10,000 hours, I'll be really good. And actually, if you ever hear Malcolm Gladwell talk about that, he'll say that's not what he's talking about, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. It's not just about the time, right? So just because you hit the piano key for 10,000 hours doesn't mean you're going to be an awesome piano player. It's how you spend that 10,000 hours that's important. So in psychology, what we think about in terms of that 10,000 hours or how you use that time is through this concept of deliberate practice. So it's not just practice, it's deliberate practice. It's a type of very focused practice that you are focusing on specific skills and abilities that you're trying to improve on, as opposed to just doing it to check the number of hours, right? And that's what he meant. So in one sense, I think he's absolutely right if you interpret it correctly. If you're just saying it's 10,000 hours alone, that's actually only half the story. And I'm actually working on my own research in a book right now. At least one of the parts of it is related to this idea of deliberate practice and how and why where he got the 10,000 hours from. He got the 10,000 hours from a lot of psychological research that showed why people were able to succeed, like in chess, in I think tennis. He looked at a lot of music. He looked at a lot of different areas where people were able to succeed, and he found that they had invested significant amounts of time, like this 10,000 hours. But it wasn't just 10,000 hours. It was 10,000 hours of very targeted, deliberate practice. And that's the key.
Okay, thanks, David. So, because we still have 15 minutes, our session ends at 3:30. So, I received another 4 to 5 questions. We will try to make it. And the next one is from Chris. So he says, "Hi, David. When you're teaching IMBAs, what kind of students do you like most?" So, right on that questions, I have some more want to ask. Personally, David. So there's a lot of potential candidates who wants to apply for IMBA. There are some current IMBA students and there are some alumni students here. So, what are your advice would give to our IMBA community on the about leadership?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So thanks for asking, and Evelyn, thanks for expanding. Um, so if I think of it this way, my if I just really break it down, the type of students that I love, who it doesn't matter if it's IMBA, undergrad, it doesn't matter. The type of students I love are students who just are trying to be better. The type of students who I don't like having in class are students who are just there to get a diploma, right? They're just there to check a box, right? What I really love is students who are just really focused on trying to be the best version of themselves every day, right? And that's really inspiring to me. I think that's one of the great life projects that we have. So you try to be better than we are. The students, again, who are just there, but that's not their focus. Maybe they're there. Oh, I just need a diploma. I don't care what I learn, or I just want to check a box. Those are the students who are the most frustrating for me. And because I always feel like for every student who takes a seat, who has that attitude of like, oh, I'm just here to check a box, then they're taking a seat from somebody else who would have really contributed because they want to improve so much. And imagine if you have a network of, let's say there's 80 people in your IMBA cohort or 70 people, and all of the students there are just focused on, hey, we want to try to help each other become our best selves. I mean, that would just be a tremendous group to be a part of. That would be able to do a lot of great things, I think.
Okay, so what? My other question is, um, how would you? What are the advice we would give to the current students and their alumni that who has already taken your course? Do you have any words to
Oh
them?
my goodness, that's a hard question. Uh, um, wow. Usually this is like the first time in a long time where I have to. I'm a bit stumped by the question. What I would say is this, and this is again something I've been thinking about. I think it's important increasingly to try to live a life with no regrets. And again, people will make mistakes, and that's okay. You may make a bad business decision, and that's okay. So I'm not talking about those kind of things, but I'm talking about really, having deep regrets about just making bad life choices. And as you think about the decisions that you're making, trying to say, hey, is this a decision that I'm going to regret if in 5 or 10 years? Or on the flip side, you think of it this way: if I don't try, will I regret not trying? I think thinking about that, I think that's an interesting mental lens to think about life in terms of trying to make the decisions that you want, right? So thinking using regret as a tool of trying to think about what kind of legacy you want. And so I'll give you an example. Um, so when I was first working in finance at Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong, worked through the financial crisis. I did that for 3 years, and it was difficult working through the financial crisis. It was hard, but I had been lucky. I hadn't been fired. I still had a job. All these things were happening. But at a certain point, I decided, you know what? I want to travel. I wasn't married at the time, and I had more freedom. And so I decided to quit my job, and I basically was going to travel for a year. And at the time, a lot of people, including my parents, thought that was a terrible decision. They said we're in the middle of an economic crisis. Lots of all these bad things. Why are you're lucky that you didn't get laid off? Why are you voluntarily giving your job up to go travel? And for me, it felt like the right thing to do. And ultimately, I felt like if I don't do this, I'll regret it because I don't think I'd have time to do this. So I ended up traveling, quite a bit during that time. And during that travels, I ended up meeting my wife. We ended up getting married. We ended up having children, etc. And had I not done that, we would have never met, right? We'd have never had our family, etc. And so, as I think about that, when I think about that, I always think, for me, it felt like the right thing to do. I didn't know what the outcome would be, but it felt like the right thing to do. And I know if I didn't do it, I would have had regrets because I felt like I will always be able to work another year or two. Like not, taking this time out not to work now, especially since I didn't have any family commitments, that didn't seem like a big sacrifice. But when I thought about my life when I'm, in old age, and I look back, I think I would have regretted not taking that time to explore the world. And I think for me, when I did take that time, it certainly made me a better person. It made me more well-rounded, but also it allowed me to meet my wife and have the family that we have. And so for me, I'm grateful I didn't regret not that decision. I'm grateful I took that decision and used regret as a catalyst for me to actually make the decision.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And so, no regret. And if you're hesitating not whether to apply for IMBA, so try do it. Otherwise, there's no regret. um, so there's a few more questions about leadership. So Dora Do, she asked, does leadership can learn or experience is more important? And on the related question, there's another one from Xiao Huanxi, and she asked, in your view, what is most important to be a leader? So I think this question is kind of related, so I asked them together. So wait a second, let me. Oh, yep.
Yeah. So idea of what's important as a leader and can leadership be learned? I think there's a professor at Harvard Business School named Bill George who used to be a CEO of a very large medical manufacturing company called Medtronics. medical equipment company called Medtronics. But now he teaches and he writes and does a lot of research on the concept of authentic leadership. And I would, from his research, which I've read a lot, and I read a lot of his stuff and think about it. I think we oftentimes think, because of how we hear stories or the history we read, that leaders somehow they're just born, right? Like they come out, they come out as babies, and somehow they're just leaders from 6 months old, and that's actually completely not true, right? Every leader that I think that's a good leader has a series of experiences in their life that gave them some foundation to think about the decisions that they're going to make. And so, how do we become a good leader? I think that's a difficult question. I don't think there's one set path for everybody. Some of my former students will have heard me say everybody has to find their own path up the mountain. I think that runs true for leaders. But at the same time, what is the key? First is understanding that you can learn how to be a leader. A lot of the traits of good leadership are acquired through experience and learning. So those can all be learned. Almost all of them can be learned. That's the first thing. Second thing, as part of that, then you have to have the mentality that you can learn, right? That who you are today is not who you're going to be tomorrow. And so some of you may be familiar with a psychological concept called growth mindset. This has become quite popular in corporate training the last few years, this idea of growth mindset. But basically, it just boils down to they have fixed mindset and growth mindset. People who have a fixed mindset think, oh, I am just this way, I can't do it. So, for example, a classic example of fixed mindset is, oh, I'm not good at math, so I'm not going to, I can't, there's no point in trying. That's classic fixed mindset. Growth mindset mentality is, I may not be good at math now, but I'm going to continue to learn and practice so I can become better, right? And it's a very different mindset, but that mindset has very profound outcomes on your willingness to put effort in and to improve. And so if we actually all of this ties into a lot of the themes we've been talking about. So if your idea is to become a better leader, then it's important for you to have growth mindset. If you have growth mindset, then you want to strive to improve. And if you want to strive to improve, then you want to continue to do disciplined improvement, this 1% improvement. And as long as you continue to do that, you'll develop a lot of the leadership competencies about receiving feedback, about being able to connect the dots, etc., to be a more agile leader. So all of these are very much connected. Now, related to that, what is most important to be a leader? I think if you ask 10 business school professors this, they'll give you 10 different answers. But in my own opinion, I think it's authenticity. I think it's people knowing that you are authentic, that you are sincere in your approach. And related to that, understanding your purpose and organizational purpose. I feel like if you can have those two things, a lot of things become much easier. Why? Because if you have organizational purpose, if you have purpose about the organization and you have clear purpose about yourself, then a lot of things out there in the world, they may not matter because you know what you're focused on. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is about authenticity. If you have authenticity, then what that should mean is people will trust you. It will also help you be a better communicator. And so maybe the one thing maybe I would encourage is you may be able to find this online, but about a week ago, the CEO of Marriott International, his last name is Sorensen, President Sorensen, he shared a message with the Marriott International Associates, employees. And it was 4 or 5 minutes long. And it's really powerful example of authentic leadership because he's very clear about how difficult this situation is. He knows the significant impact it's going to have. But you can tell that what he's saying is very authentic. And on top of that, it's also profound because you'll see if you watch this video that he has no hair right now. The reason he has no hair is because he has cancer. And so imagine you're a CEO of a company, large company, you have cancer, and then your company is going through this crisis, right? And so, but he has incredible authenticity. So when I talk to employees or read about employees who saw that video, it had a really tremendous impact on them because they know he was being so authentic and genuine. And so if we go back to this idea, what is most important to a leader? I feel like those are two things. Having clear purpose, both individually and organizationally, and then really trying to be the most authentic that you can be, right? And people know that. And those two things together, I think, can help you help guide you as a leader.
Okay, thank you, David. So last question. So because we are now 3:30, very last questions. This question is from Sylvia. I think she is our IMBA student who took your course 1 or 2 years ago. She asked, in this special times, what do you think is the most important thing to us as a employer? And what are your tips or comments and for us in such a difficult time?
So, Evelyn, so just to clarify, is that like what's the most important thing for the students or people who are working?
Office, working.
People who are working.
Yep.
Yeah. Um, so this is interesting. I've been taught this as well this week. I was writing email to some students in my current class because we haven't been able to see them, right? We haven't had in class. We've only been doing this kind of video type of classes. Certainly what's going on is worrying, of course. Like if you're not worried at all, then that's a problem, right? This is a very unique, difficult, unprecedented situation, right? Clearly. That said, I'm not the type of person generally that likes to spend a lot of time worrying about things that I can't control. I want to spend most of my time thinking about things that I can control, right? The things that I can control an outcome on. And so that would be, I would just say two things. That would be the first thing. Of course, it's worrying, but move more of your energy away from worrying about the things that you can't control to the things that you can control, and then use that as a positive energy. So that's the first thing. And the second thing related to that is, though we all have big picture plans, I know we talked about strategic thinking. People that spend too much time dreaming never get anything done. So people who spend too much time thinking about the future don't get things done. So there has to be a balance between strategic thinking and then execution. And so when I say think 3 steps ahead, that means think 3 steps ahead, and potentially those plans can change, right? This is life, things change. But once you have your direction, then get just really focused on execution. The best organization, so I've tried to spend a lot of time thinking about, hey, why are people successful? Or why are certain organizations successful? I think oftentimes the best organizations are successful is because they just execute. Like they just get things done. Now you may say, well, we got to think about strategy, all this and that. And I think that's true. You do have to spend some time thinking about strategy and all this. But if you go in the wrong balance and spend so much more time thinking about strategy or changing strategy or doing this, ultimately at the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter that much as long as you're just executing on things. And so there's a very famous basketball coach in the United States named Mike Krzyzewski, and he is a basketball coach for the Duke University basketball team, men's basketball team. So the Duke University basketball team is usually one of the best basketball teams in the United States, and he has a saying that he tells his players, which is next play, focus on the next play, right? And I think that's important because let's say you're a basketball player and you make a mistake, you miss a shot. It's very easy to focus on, oh, this is bad. I'm worried about this, blah, blah, blah. You know what? His idea of focusing on next play is, okay, you made a mistake, learn from it, and then focus on what's next. And I think if you have that mentality of just continuing to focus on what's next, execute, you'll be able to really get a lot done and be really efficient in how you use your time as well as your energy. And so, I always try to tell people is to try to find that balance between understanding what your strategic perspective is and then focus the rest of your time on just execution, both organizationally as well as individually.
Okay, thank you, David. So we are 5 minutes overrun, and thanks for all joining. We still have, I can see more than 100 people online. Thank you for staying with us. Thanks, David, again for spending his time in the weekend and joining us. And so thanks for coming. If you are interested to our IMBA program, please scan the QR code that you've seen on the slides. Get back to us. And it's a very difficult and challenging time now. We let's be positive and be an agile leader in our life, in our work. So thanks again, David. So we will end the session now, and thanks for all joining. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye
Bye.
bye.